History is written by the victors. The official history of World War II tells a simple, heroic story. It's a story of a brave little island standing alone against tyranny, and of a powerful, generous friend across the sea, America, who stepped in to save the day. The story goes that America became the arsenal of democracy, providing the weapons that allowed Britain to fight on. The program was called Lend-Lease. It was, in Winston Churchill's famous words, the most unsorted act in the history of any nation. But what if that isn't the whole story? What if the official history is just that, a story, a carefully constructed piece of propaganda designed to hide a much darker, more cynical truth? What if the life-saving aid wasn't a gift, but a transaction, a deal signed in desperation, with terms so brutal they would help achieve what no foreign enemy ever could: the financial dismantling of the British Empire? This isn't just a story about an alliance. It's a story about a changing of the guard, the most audacious financial power play in modern history, where the United States used a world war to sideline its greatest rival, inheriting the keys to a global empire, not on the battlefield, but on a balance sheet. On December 29, 2006, the British Treasury made a final electronic payment of about $83 million to the United States government. 61 years after World War II had ended, a final bill was paid. But here's the twist. That payment wasn't for Lend-Lease. It was the last installment on a massive post-war loan that Britain was forced to take because the war, and the terms of Lend-Lease itself, had left it utterly bankrupt. Most people think Lend-Lease was America's generous gift to a friend. This video will show you how it was actually used as the ultimate leverage in a calculated strategy that bankrupted an empire and cemented America's position as the undisputed master of the New World Order. Section 1. The setup, the illusion of power. To understand the scale of this takeover, you have to understand the target. In 1939, on the eve of war, the British Empire was, without question, the greatest power the world had ever known. The red of the British map sprawled across a quarter of the Earth's landmass, and it governed nearly a quarter of the world's population. It was an empire on which the sun, quite literally, never set. But its real power wasn't just land or armies. It was financial. London was the capital of global finance. The British pound sterling was the world's reserve currency, the bedrock of international trade. If you wanted to buy oil from the Middle East or rubber from Malaya, you did it in pounds. This dominance was protected by a powerful economic fortress called the Sterling Area. This was a block of countries that pegged their currencies to the pound and held their reserves in London. More than that, the empire was bound by imperial preference, a system of trade rules that favored goods made within the empire, creating a massive, closed-off trading zone that locked out competitors like the United States. It was a system designed to keep the wealth of the empire flowing back to London. On paper, Britain was the world's largest creditor. But this was an illusion, a magnificent, sprawling, but ultimately hollow structure. Beneath the surface, the empire was dangerously fragile. Its wealth was tied up in things it couldn't spend quickly: factories, railways, and plantations scattered across the globe. Its power was illiquid, and the rise of industrial powers, especially the United States, had been chipping away at its dominance for decades. By 1939, America held the world's largest hoard of gold, around $14 billion. Britain, master of a global empire, had only about $2 billion in gold reserves. In the coming storm, cash would be king, and Britain was cash poor. It was a giant standing on a foundation of glass, and Germany was about to throw a stone. Section 2. The crisis, the brink of collapse. When war was declared in September 1939, America stayed neutral. President Franklin D. Roosevelt offered sympathy, but U.S. law demanded a policy of cash and carry. The terms were brutally simple. If Britain wanted to buy American weapons to fight Germany, it could, but it had to pay for them up front, in cash American dollars, and it had to transport them on its own ships, braving the German U-boats prowling the Atlantic. No loans, no credit, cash on the barrelhead. For Britain, this was a death sentence in slow motion. The war demanded a torrent of American supplies, and every bullet, every barrel of oil, drained Britain's precious and limited reserves of gold and dollars. Throughout 1940, a secret fleet of British warships began a series of desperate journeys across the Atlantic. This was Operation Fish. The ships weren't carrying troops. They were carrying Britain's entire national treasure. Gold bars and foreign securities, worth billions, were sent on a perilous voyage to vaults in Canada, all to pay America's bills. It was the single largest movement of wealth in human history, a nation shipping its entire savings account overseas just to stay in the fight. By December 1940, it was over. Britain was broke. The gold was gone. The dollars were spent. On December 7, 1940, a full year before Pearl Harbor, a desperate Winston Churchill wrote to Roosevelt. The bravado was gone, replaced by the stark reality of the balance sheet. The moment is fast approaching, he wrote, when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. This was Britain's moment of maximum vulnerability. Its cities were being pounded by the Blitz, and its treasury was empty. It had bled itself dry paying America for the tools of its own survival. A desperate nation will sign anything to stay alive. The stage was set. America, the creditor, held all the cards. It was time to offer a solution. Section 3. The solution: the garden hose propaganda. With Britain on its knees, Roosevelt unveiled his masterstroke, a plan that would be sold as an act of selfless generosity. He called it Lend-Lease. In a press conference, he used a simple, folksy analogy that became a propaganda masterpiece. Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, he said, and I have a length of garden hose. I don't say to him, "Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over." It was a beautiful image. America wasn't an arms dealer. It was a good Samaritan. The Lend-Lease Act passed in March 1941. Over the next 4 years, America would ship an incredible $31.4 billion in aid to the British Empire. This aid was the lifeline that allowed Britain to survive. But this wasn't charity, and the garden hose analogy was a masterful deception. The truth of Lend-Lease was buried in the agreements hammered out in secret between desperate British officials and the shrewd men of the U.S. Treasury, led by Henry Morgenthau Jr. Morgenthau wasn't interested in lending garden hoses. He saw Britain's desperation as the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to use America's financial power to rewrite the rules of the global economy. Before a single crate of Lend equipment was shipped, his team presented demands that had little to do with defeating Germany and everything to do with dismantling the British Empire. This wasn't a loan. It was leverage. Section 4. The fine print: the empire-killing clauses. The genius of the American plan was that its most lethal weapons were camouflaged in the dry language of trade agreements. The clause that would cripple the British Empire was Article VII of the Master Lend-Lease Agreement. On the surface, it sounded noble, calling for the elimination of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. But discriminatory treatment was Washington's code for one thing: imperial preference. As we saw, imperial preference was the economic glue holding the British Empire together. It created a vast, protected market that American corporations desperately wanted to break into. Article VII was the crowbar to pry that market open. John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant British economist negotiating the terms, was horrified. He saw Article VII as a demand that Britain voluntarily demolish its own economic fortress in exchange for wartime aid. He knew a bankrupt, post-war Britain would be at the mercy of America's industrial might. But the U.S. State Department, under Cordell Hull, was almost religious in its zeal for open-door trade policies. The war provided the perfect opportunity to force that door open. The British were trapped. To refuse meant the end of Lend-Lease and defeat. To accept meant agreeing to liquidate their economic empire. Once the fighting was over, they chose survival. They signed, but the demands didn't stop there. The U.S. Treasury insisted that before Britain could be considered eligible for aid, it had to prove it was truly destitute by liquidating its remaining American assets. Morgenthau demanded that Britain's vast portfolio of American stocks and bonds, built up over generations, be put on the block. The British argued that a forced fire sale would be catastrophic. Morgenthau's response was simple: liquidate everything first, then we'll talk. Section 5. The foreclosure asset stripping in practice. The asset stripping began even before Lend-Lease was signed. In September 1940, Roosevelt proposed the Destroyers for Bases deal. The deal was simple. America would give Britain 50 of its old World War I-era destroyers. While desperately needed, many were in rough shape and needed extensive repairs. In exchange, Britain granted the U.S. 99-year leases on a string of naval and air bases across the British Empire, from Bermuda to Jamaica and Trinidad. Think about that. Britain handed America strategic control of its imperial backyard for nearly a century in exchange for 50 aging, surplus ships. It was a stunning strategic victory for the United States, setting the pattern for what was to come. The most notorious example of financial asset stripping was the case of the American Viscose Corporation, or Avisco. Avisco was a massive American rayon company, but it was owned by a British parent, Cordalds. It was a crown jewel of British overseas investment, worth well over $100 million. Henry Morgenthau targeted it directly. He gave the British an ultimatum: sell Avisco immediately, or he would let the Lend-Lease bill die in Congress. The British were aghast, but Morgenthau was relentless. In March 1941, the British government used its emergency powers to seize Avisco from its private owners. The sale was a bloodbath. American investment firms, led by Morgan Stanley, knew Britain was over a barrel and drove a merciless bargain. The company was sold for just $54 million, about half its true worth. The dollars went directly into the U.S. Treasury. This wasn't a transaction between allies. It was a foreclosure. And while America was lending, Britain and its Commonwealth were providing a huge amount of aid back to the United States under reverse Lend-Lease. This amounted to nearly $8 billion. American troops in Britain were housed in barracks, fed with food, and used ports and airfields, all built and paid for by the British. The United States was using the British Empire as a global network of forward operating bases, all while positioning itself as the world's great benefactor. Section 6. The aftermath: post-war strangulation. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. In London, people celebrated, believing the partnership with America would now turn to rebuilding. They were catastrophically wrong. Just 6 days later, on August 21, 1945, President Harry Truman signed an executive order. Lend-Lease was terminated. Immediately. Abruptly. The shock in London was profound. Britain's economy was a wreck, geared entirely for war. The country was importing half its food, all paid for with Lend-Lease dollars. Now, the funding was gone. Britain was victorious, but it was also, once again, bankrupt. And in this moment of extreme weakness, America presented its final bill. To survive, Britain needed a new loan, and the only place to get it was Washington. John Maynard Keynes was sent to negotiate, but this time as a supplicant. The result was the Anglo-American loan of 1946. The U.S. agreed to lend Britain $3.75 billion at 2% interest, to be repaid over 50 years. This is the loan whose final installment was paid in 2006. But the real poison was in the conditions. America reimposed the key demand from Article Roman 7. Britain had to make the pound sterling freely convertible into U.S. dollars within a year. In simple terms, anyone in the world holding pounds could now demand to exchange them for dollars from Britain's new loan. It was a clause designed to formally enthrone the dollar as the world's new reserve currency. For Britain, it was a catastrophe. On July 15, 1947, convertibility went into effect. The result was a stampede. Countries rushed to dump their pounds for dollars. In just 5 weeks, over $1 billion of Britain's precious American loan hemorrhaged out of its reserves. The British government had to go back to Washington and beg for permission to suspend the convertibility it had just started. The damage was done. The sterling crisis of 1947 was the final, fatal blow to the pound's prestige. The financial heart of the empire had failed. Section 7. The conclusion, the New World Order. Let's retrace the steps of this extraordinary financial power play. Step 1. Bleed the target dry with cash and carry, forcing Britain to liquidate its gold and cash reserves. Step 2. Introduce Lend-Lease, sold as a garden hose but structured with an entry price. The forced fire sale of prime assets like Avisco and the trading of strategic territory in the destroyers for bases deal. Step 3. Embed a poison pill. Article Roman 7, forcing Britain to commit to dismantling the imperial preference system that was the economic foundation of its empire. Step 4. Abruptly terminate all aid the moment the war was won, plunging the exhausted British economy into a new crisis. And the final blow, the Anglo-American loan, which saddled Britain with 60 years of debt and whose convertibility clause triggered a run on the pound, cementing the U.S. dollar as the new master of the world economy. By 1950, the transfer of power was complete. The United States held 2/3 of the world's gold. The dollar was the global reserve currency. The American military occupied a global network of bases, many of them formerly British. Deprived of its economic engine, the British Empire began to rapidly disintegrate, culminating in the Suez Crisis of 1956, when the U.S. financially crushed a British operation, proving Britain could now only act with Washington's permission. The British Empire wasn't defeated in a war. It was foreclosed on. The Roosevelt and Truman administrations brilliantly and ruthlessly used the war to supplant the British Empire and establish the United States as the new global superpower. They didn't inherit the world. They bought it with Britain's money. The most unsorted act turned out to be the most profitable acquisition ever made. Did you know the full story behind Lend-Lease? What other hidden histories should we cover next? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deeper look into how power really works, make sure you like this video and subscribe for more stories they didn't teach you in school. Thanks for watching.